It is a great pleasure to me to be doing the very first ISSPD webinar. We're doing this from Curitiba, Brazil, which is also very exciting. I'm going to be talking about promoting positive human development globally. I'm going to be focusing globally, and we know that the world needs research knowledge for better practice and policy. As a globe, we have huge problems, but we really have great opportunity. The problems, of course, are mostly caused by us, which also means that we have the opportunity to redress what we have created. And it's true that doing research is often expensive, but the alternative, trial and error, is much more expensive. This is, of course, especially true with human development. We're talking about human beings here. At this point in history, we have very exciting and important research findings, and we know that people on the globe want things to be better. We as researchers can help policymakers and practitioners achieve this. I'm going to be focusing on a perspective called positive human development. It's a fundamentally different approach to thinking about human development. Much of prior human research has focused on what's wrong, and it involves shaming and blaming people. Viewing this from the systems perspective, this creates a vicious cycle downward so that we never solve anything, and the people that we intend to serve feel devalued in the process. The strengths approach, in contrast, is aspirational and inspirational. It focuses on the future that we want. It's supportive rather than fixing people as interveners. It permits engagement with people, which is very important, and it leads to positive change. I can identify some advantages of this approach. The first is that research, education, intervention programs, and policy can all be integrated coherently. One recent paper by Richard Lerner, just this year, linked this perspective to social justice globally, which is also an advantage. Most importantly, this approach engages people rather than distancing or alienating them as the intended beneficiaries. We know that individuals can accomplish amazing things, perhaps because of an adrenaline rush. You've heard the story about the woman who lifted a car off her child. Ordinarily, she could never do that, but she was so focused on accomplishing this, saving her child, that she did it. Taken collectively, we can do even more. We can change a great deal. The human development research field has multiple origins, much of it in education, but also in the United States, multidisciplinary departments in land-grant universities, which were designed to serve the people, and of course from disciplines like psychology. The science base is now called developmental science, takes a systems perspective grounded in the contextualized perspective on human development over the life course initiated by Urie Bronfenbrenner. The field has always been linked to learning, interventions programs, and policy. And we're now at a point where the science has advanced to serve these very well. It's a very exciting time in our field. Our science has begun to understand human development processes under the skin in interaction with individual behavior, emotions, and social context. Intervention science also has been taken up by developmental scientists, and we're beginning to have much more influence with policy, not only locally, but also globally. As with much scientific progress, the exciting discoveries in our field occur on field borders. We now know that biology and behavior are two sides of the same coin. It's not nature versus nurture, it's both and. And I just want to highlight three major areas of exciting discovery: genetics, epigenetics, neuroscience, and program and prevention research, now called intervention science. The genes we are born with are changed by epigenetic processes in interaction with experience throughout life. This work really began with Michael Meaney's research studying how the parenting behavior of mother rats licking pups at birth had positive effects on the subsequent development of those pups. This kind of finding, and that this licking behavior changed the genes of the pups. Researchers have now studied this across species and behaviors, and it's really a very well replicated finding that parenting behavior can become encoded in the genes of the offspring in a way that produces better outcomes. Michael Meaney himself is now partnering with several longitudinal studies and intervention research to understand these change processes better and how the interaction between the epigenetic process and experience of children is functioning. We know now that at least mammals and perhaps other species are built to adapt to the circumstances that they have. The effects on genes is much faster than evolutionary time, which was the prior view of gene change. We don't know yet if it's days, weeks, perhaps longer. That's under study currently. But this is the biological mechanism for behavioral change processes. It's now been applied in many areas, from mindfulness to parenting training, many others. And what we've learned is that in order to change genes, there needs to be a great deal of practice. You can't just do it once and your gene suddenly changes. This finding has huge implications for human development interventions. Another key finding is that of differential sensitivity. We know now that some are little affected by adverse circumstances, while others are profoundly affected. This is a very important finding because previously, when it was found, for example, that some children who were abused did not seem much affected by the experience, which led to people dismissing the fact that this was an important stress or adverse experience for the child. And this is true in many areas. The processes are currently unclear, but many are studying this with great intensity. And this understanding about differential sensitivity explains much research on adversity and resilience and stress research, and child maltreatment, as I just mentioned, is one of those. So this finding also has huge implications for interventions. Developmental neuroscience is the second area with exciting results currently that's changing how we understand human development. This field is rapidly progressing and promises to be like epigenetics in providing under-the-skin processes for observed behavior change, that flip side of the coin. There are several age periods that are the primary focus of this research. Infancy probably has the most focus. There's also many researchers studying aging and adolescence. The central tenet of this research, like the epigenetics research, is that the organism develops in response to experience. So the experiences that we have as human beings are extremely important to the development of the biological infrastructure that we have. One important finding that is startling in my view, but fits with this whole area is that cell biologists know that non-neuronal cells completely recycle within our bodies every 90 days. Neuronal cells are more stable, but we know that brain changes occur throughout life. So let's consider just for a second the implications of this cell replacement. If our cells, except for our brains, are recycling every 90 days, what makes us human? Our brains, likely, but also likely is our culture. Our culture requires support and respect, social relationships, language. We know that all these are extremely important. We also know that the brain requires protection from pollutants, accidents, and that lifelong learning is extremely important for a healthy brain. I want to just give a few examples of developmental neuroscience research. Child maltreatment research has focused extensively on effects on the brain, as well as other early adversity stress research, and demonstrated profound effects. And I provide on the slide one reference from a report from the U.S. National Academies of Science. Also, another researcher, and there are many, just mentioned the Blakemore research with adolescents. She's one of the leading researchers looking at brain changes in adolescence, and interactions with peers, for example, affect brain changes. One other area to mention that's very close to developmental neuroscience is called cultural neuroscience, and Shinobu Kitayama, my colleague at Michigan, is one of these researchers. They have found that cultural norms affect social behavior through neuroplasticity, and the primary paradigm that these researchers are using is migration from a collective culture to a more individualistic, such as we have in the United States. They find that those who move to the United States not only have behavior changes toward that individual norm, but their brain changes as well. And it's repeated practice that influences brain processing. They've identified at least one of the genes involved in transmitting cultural variation. And at one meeting I attended, the researchers involved talked about this changing our conception of what it means to be human. Intervention science is the last area I'm calling out as one of the most exciting areas influencing human development research. And there, of course, are many others, but these are just three that I'm mentioning. We've known for a long time that the best way to understand behavior or development is to change it. Intervention science is now very active in minority world research, but that is rapidly changing. And let me just mention, in case you don't know that term, minority world and majority world, that the minority world is predominantly the high-income areas of the world, such as US, Canada, Europe, Australia. Majority world is the entire rest of the world. The minority world is about 10% of the population, but it has been the area of most activity. But we really want, if we want to understand the populations globally, we must engage the majority world as well. There is a recent paper that looked at effective intervention practices in the majority world. The reference is at least part of the reference is listed at the bottom of this slide. In that study, Wormley and colleagues found that the most effective interventions were developmentally appropriate for whatever age is of interest. It must be culturally appropriate to the population, and it's best to be community-based. Mixed method approaches seem to be highly effective, and that mixed method approaches are combining quantitative and qualitative data. And of course, randomized controlled trials give the strongest predictability. Stepping back a bit, let's consider what the purpose of research is. Of course, the immediate response that most would have is that it's for discovery and understanding, but sometimes it's also to solve problems. And we in the minority world are primarily the place that has the luxury and the funding to conduct basic research focused on discovery. I would also note that many minority world researchers have been naive about the application process to real world problems. I've heard colleagues express an expectation that their research findings should be discovered and used by policymakers and practitioners, and they do not, as researchers, feel responsible for the applications. There are, of course, some very important exceptions, and I've just mentioned in this slide some of the Australian and New Zealand research groups that have done excellent policy research. But I also have observed that many majority world researchers just make the assumption that their research should be engaged with policy and practice change, and I mentioned Suman Verma in India. I believe that researchers should be responsible for the positive use of research. We have to recognize that practitioners and policymakers can do their work without research, and in general, they're not motivated to seek research results. Their motivation and focus is grounded in their prevailing practice and training, and occasionally, of course, in making money. Those who are motivated to help people might listen to persuasive and effective examples of research. We of course have many excellent examples of accomplishing policy and practice results from research, and ECE, early childhood education, is one of the best examples that now is being applied globally for helping young children have healthy development. In some parts of the minority world now, evidence-based policy and practice is emerging as the expectation, but it's not yet pervasive everywhere. This little cartoon shows the importance of considering unintended consequences of our research. The fireman in this cartoon, of course, didn't think about the implication of saving that woman jumping off one building using a trampoline which just projected her into the building across the way. This is a silly example, but there are many examples in real life of products created to improve life that in fact have polluted our planet. Also side effects of drugs that cause more damage than they cure. And we could think of many others. I'm really persuaded that that systems thinking can be very helpful for research. And this is one of the feedback loops that come from systems research, that it's very important to begin with policy relevant theory and move to systems change research, where we're understanding how we can actually change these systems that we live in. Then after an initial experiment or intervention, learning from the scale up, and finally creating and improving policy. And this kind of thinking can also help us avoid unintended consequences. There are other ways to create effective policy and practice research. We need to think about how we communicate, especially to people who might be able to use it in policy and practice. Sometimes this is called marketing. Researchers usually avoid doing this, but we need to consider effective ways to communicate. Of course, we need excellent implementation in all its aspects. Excellent implementation is the most difficult kind of research to do, but it's extremely important. And it's very challenging, but increasingly we know more about doing this well. This requires tremendous persistence, which I think I have, but patience is important as well. That's harder for me. So how can we accomplish this? I think we need to think about building global research capacity if we really want to know how to have effective human development research globally. We know we need to have knowledge from everywhere. The current model for big studies is that minority world researchers extract data from the majority world. And this is really just like extracting minerals, oil, natural resources, and then taking them for the benefit of the minority world. It often does not benefit the majority world. A more effective model is a collaborative one, which requires an intentional research design engaged by both minority world and majority world researchers, senior as well as early career scholars. And I believe that engaging early career scholars in this global research is a way that they will ensure this future. In this model, minority world researchers would own their data, it wouldn't be extracted, and all participants would learn equitably. And I want to just add that, of course, majority world researchers can do research perfectly well on their own, engage in collaborations with whoever they wish. I'm really referring to these big studies engaged by places like the World Bank, by the Gates Foundation, and other global funders. So if we think about the vision for this future human development research, we would have researchers and collaborative projects on all globally important issues. Some examples of these would include the implications of migration. We, of course, have many important studies on migration, but typically they're locally or regionally focused, and we need to begin to pull those findings together for better migration, immigration policy. Another area would be the implications for human development of global climate change. And a third I would mention is extremely important. We know that conflict and violence more generally is devastating to human populations, but we need to understand better both the processes of preventing that and helping people who have experienced conflict to have healthier lives. Collaborative design processes to achieve these are extremely important, and it would also be good to engage global policymakers in the design process from the beginning. The goal is to achieve global research infrastructure and knowledge. The infrastructure is what would make subsequent research sustainable, and the knowledge can help us now. One possible locus for this is the emerging International Consortium for Developmental Science Societies that is beginning to undertake such projects. Human development research can help make the world a better place. By using thoughtful collaborative research designs to address key policy and practice questions, we can begin to know how to help people and have an improved world. We need to conduct outstanding research, and we should create outstanding interventions that we know will make a difference. We can do this. Thanks.